Aliyah Daniels, the spark of individuality. Aliyah Daniels wasn't just another 16-year-old high school student. At East Ridge Academy, she was known for more than her academic brilliance and involvement in extracurriculars. Whether on the debate team, leading student council initiatives, or tutoring her peers, Aliyah exuded confidence and charisma. But there was one feature that made her stand out even more: her natural hair. She wore her hair unapologetically in thick, coiled curls, or styled in creative braids that honored her heritage. Each twist and coil was a declaration of identity, a reminder of the ancestors who fought so she could stand tall today. Her mother always said, "Your hair is your crown, baby. Wear it proudly." And Aliyah did. But East Ridge Academy wasn't always a place that celebrated individuality. Although Aliyah excelled in school, she often found herself on the receiving end of subtle yet hurtful comments. A teacher would glance at her hair and say, "Interesting choice," or ask if it was appropriate for the event. The school staff liked her, but only when she blended in. Still, Aliyah remained undeterred. She had dealt with these microaggressions long enough to know that their problem wasn't with her, but with their limited idea of what professional should look like. She knew she belonged, and no one could convince her otherwise. The morning of the incident, on the morning everything changed, Aliyah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, gently sectioning her thick, black hair. She decided on intricate cornrows that trailed into long braids cascading past her shoulders. She took her time, twisting each strand carefully, ensuring her hair looked as neat as possible. Today wasn't just any day. She had a presentation for her environmental science class. The topic was climate change, and Aliyah had spent weeks preparing. She wanted her presentation to spark real conversations. She knew the facts, had rehearsed the slides, and was ready to inspire her classmates to care about the planet. As she admired her reflection, she felt a flicker of doubt. She could already imagine the stares, the whispers, and maybe even another veiled comment from Principal Barrett, the rigid school administrator who ran the academy. Barrett had always looked at her with a certain coldness, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. But Aliyah shook off the negativity, straightened her posture, and slipped on her favorite gold hoop earrings. "They'll see me for who I am," she whispered to herself. "Not just my hair." Her mother beamed as she saw her daughter come downstairs. "Look at you, baby. You're gonna blow them away." Aliyah smiled, but deep down, that nagging doubt lingered. She grabbed her backpack and gave her mom a quick hug. "Remember," her mom said gently, "you belong wherever you stand." The presentation that sparked a fire. The day progressed like any other, with Aliyah flowing from one class to the next. Teachers complimented her academic work, and her friends hyped her up for the big presentation. But as she walked through the hallways, she felt the familiar stares. "Why do people act like my hair is a national event?" she muttered under her breath. Finally, the time for her presentation arrived. Aliyah entered the classroom with her laptop in hand and a sense of purpose in her heart. Her classmates shuffled in, and the room grew quiet as she pulled up her slides. She took a deep breath and smiled. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "Today, I'll be talking about climate change, one of the biggest challenges our generation faces." Her words flowed effortlessly, her voice clear and steady. She laid out the facts: rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and the communities most affected by environmental degradation, many of which were already vulnerable. She glanced at the room. The students were engaged, and even the teacher watched her with admiration. Aliyah knew she was making an impact. "We can't wait for politicians to fix this. Change starts with us," she said passionately. "If each of us makes small but meaningful changes, we can create a better future." When she clicked to the final slide, a bold message appeared: "The time to act is now." The room erupted in applause. Aliyah felt a wave of relief and joy wash over her. She had delivered more than just a presentation. She had shared a piece of herself. As she returned to her seat, she noticed the classroom door swing open, Principal Barrett stood in the doorway, his expression cold and stern. "Aaliyah Daniels," he said sharply, "I need to see you in my office. Now." The confrontation. The applause faded as confusion filled the room. Aaliyah's classmates exchanged worried glances, and the teacher's encouraging smile vanished. Aaliyah felt her heart drop, but she stood up slowly, her back straight, and followed Principal Barrett down the corridor. The walk to his office felt like an eternity. Aaliyah's mind raced. What could this be about? When they reached the office, Barrett closed the door behind them with an unsettling finality. He sat down at his desk, folding his hands. "Do you know why I brought you here?" he asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Aaliyah shook her head. "No, sir." Barrett leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your hair. We've received complaints. It's distracting and unprofessional. This is a learning environment, not a fashion show." Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "My hair is neat and styled. It doesn't break any school rules." Barrett sighed, as if exhausted by the conversation. "The school's dress code requires students to maintain an appearance that aligns with our standards. Your braids are, well, let's say they don't fit the image we expect from our students." Aaliyah clenched her fists beneath the desk. She could feel the anger rising, but she refused to let it show. "This isn't just about my hair," she said quietly. "This is about identity. My hair is part of who I am, and it's not hurting anyone." Barrett leaned back, his expression hardening. "You're a smart girl, Aaliyah. But rules are rules. Either you change your hair or you face suspension." Aaliyah felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath her. "Suspension? For braids?" "Yes," Barrett said coldly. "Effective immediately if you don't comply." The aftermath. The news of Aaliyah's suspension spread quickly through the school. By the time she left Barrett's office, her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends. Some offered words of support, others were confused, and a few suggested she should have just gone along with the rules. At home, her parents were furious. Her mother paced the living room, her fists clenched, while her father sat at the dining table, his jaw tight with silent rage. "They think they can get away with this," her mother fumed. "Not on my watch. We'll fight this," her father said firmly. "This isn't just about Aaliyah's hair. This is about discrimination." Aaliyah sat quietly, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions. She had always known that being herself came with challenges, but now her identity was being treated like a problem to be fixed, and it stung more deeply than she had imagined. Her mother turned to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're not backing down, baby. We'll fight this, and we'll win." Aaliyah nodded slowly, feeling the spark of determination reignite within her. She wasn't just going to fight for herself. She was going to fight for every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. This was only the beginning. The fallout and awakening. Aaliyah's suspension hit harder than she anticipated. The night she returned home, her family sat together, their kitchen table littered with papers, legal documents, news articles, and screenshots of social media posts. She scrolled through her phone, the same phrase repeating in her messages and notifications. What happened? Her friends were outraged. Some had posted under the trending hashtag #StandWithAliyah, calling out the school for its blatant discrimination. Others messaged her directly with words of support. But then there were the uncomfortable messages, the ones suggesting she should have just worn her hair in a bun or conformed to avoid trouble. These stung the most. Even people she considered close friends didn't seem to understand the weight of what she was going through. She tossed her phone aside and let out a heavy sigh. "Sweetie, I know it's hard right now," her mom said softly, sitting across from her. "But this fight isn't just about you. It's bigger than all of us. If you let them shame you into silence, what does that say to the next girl who wants to wear her natural hair proudly?" Her dad, a man of few but meaningful words, leaned in, resting his hands on the table. "Aaliyah, What they're doing to you is exactly what people in power have been doing for generations. They set rules designed to push people like us to the margins, so we shrink, fit into their mold, and stop standing out. But we can't let them win." Alia nodded, but doubt still gnawed at her. "How do I fight when I feel like I've already lost?" she whispered. Her dad's eyes softened. "You fight by refusing to be small." At that moment, her mom's phone buzzed with a notification. It was from a local news outlet. They wanted to interview Alia about the incident. Her suspension had become the talk of the town, and the community was rallying behind her. Parents, activists, and even former students began sharing their own experiences with biased school policies targeting black students. The conversation was growing, and Alia was at the center of it. Her mom gave her a hopeful smile. "You've already started something, baby. Now, it's up to you how far it goes." The next morning, Alia woke to find that her story had gone viral. News channels picked it up, and local civil rights organizations were calling for the school district to be held accountable. Her suspension wasn't just a personal setback anymore. It had sparked a movement. As she sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through the flood of posts under the hashtag Stand with Alia, she felt a glimmer of hope. But there was also fear. This wasn't just school drama anymore. It was becoming something much bigger, and the pressure was mounting. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. Her mom answered it, and Alia could hear voices in the hallway. Moments later, her mom returned with an older woman she didn't recognize. "This is Mrs. Collins," her mom said warmly. "She's with the local NAACP chapter. She heard about what happened and wanted to offer some advice." The woman smiled kindly at Alia. "I've been fighting these battles a long time," she said, sitting down beside her on the couch. "And I know how exhausting it can be. But I want you to understand something. You're not alone in this. There are people ready to stand with you, to make sure you're heard." Mrs. Collins explained that the NAACP was organizing a protest outside the school. "It's not just about your suspension," she said. "It's about sending a message that discriminatory policies have no place in our schools, or anywhere." Alia felt the weight of those words sink in. This fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to every student who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been punished for expressing who they were. The day of the protest arrived quickly. Outside East Lake High, a sea of students, parents, and community members gathered, holding signs that read, "Our hair, our pride, and end racist policies now." Alia stood at the center, holding her own sign with trembling hands. She looked out at the crowd and saw familiar faces, her friends, her parents, and even teachers who had quietly supported her over the years, but were now standing openly by her side. Maya, her best friend, wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I told you we got your back," she whispered with a grin. Alia took a deep breath and stepped forward. Microphones and cameras were pointed at her, capturing every moment. Her heart pounded, but she knew what she had to do. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about every student who's ever been told that they need to change who they are to fit in. This is about a system that tells us our culture, our identity, and our pride aren't good enough." The crowd cheered in response. She continued, "I was suspended because my natural hair was labeled unprofessional. But let me tell you something. My hair isn't a distraction. It's not unprofessional. It's not a problem that needs fixing. It's a part of who I am, just like it's a part of every black student who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." As Alia spoke, she saw tears in the eyes of some of the parents and students. Her words resonated far beyond the walls of East Lake High. This was about reclaiming dignity, pride, and identity in a world that tried to strip them away. "And to Mr. Daniels," Alia added, her voice rising, "you tried to silence me. But today, I'm louder than ever." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices united in support. For the first time in days, Alia felt a deep sense of relief and empowerment. As the protest continued, news reporters interviewed students and parents, many of whom shared their own experiences with discriminatory policies. The school district quickly found itself under intense scrutiny. Pressure mounted on the administration to take action, and within hours, the school board released a statement promising to review and revise its policies. But for Aaliyah, the fight was far from over. Mrs. Collins and the NAACP lawyers advised her family to pursue legal action against the school, arguing that her suspension violated her civil rights. Aaliyah knew that this was the right thing to do, not just for herself, but for every student who would come after her. In the days that followed, Aaliyah's story continued to make headlines. Schools across the state began reviewing their dress codes, and students who had faced similar discrimination started sharing their stories under the hashtag #StandWithAaliyah hashtag. The principal, Mr. Daniels, remained silent, but rumors swirled about his previous scandals. Mrs. Turner, the family's lawyer, assured them that the evidence against him was mounting. "This is just the beginning," Mrs. Turner told them during one of their meetings. "We're going to make sure that what happened to you never happens to another student again." As Aaliyah lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she thought about everything that had happened. She had been suspended for her hair, a part of herself that she had once been told was a burden, a distraction, something to be hidden. But now it felt like a crown. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with her family, her friends, and her community by her side, Aaliyah felt ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a movement. And she wasn't backing down. A storm brewed behind closed doors. Days after the protest, Aaliyah stood at the heart of a whirlwind. What had begun as a personal battle was now a public movement, gathering strength faster than she'd imagined. Every corner of her life, from her inbox to her neighborhood, buzzed with messages of solidarity. Yet beneath the surface of this overwhelming support, a storm brewed, one that Aaliyah would soon have to face head-on. Mr. Daniels, the school's principal, still hadn't issued any public apology. And while the school board promised to review the policies, Aaliyah knew that words alone were never enough. She had learned from her parents, from history, and now from first-hand experience, that real change was fought for, not handed down easily. The pressure mounted at home as the media continued covering the story. Aaliyah's parents fielded interview requests while coordinating with Mrs. Turner, their family lawyer, about the legal case they were building against the school. Aaliyah's suspension wasn't just an isolated incident. Mrs. Turner believed it was a symptom of deeper, systemic issues rooted in the school district, and she was determined to uncover the full truth. The first crack in Daniel's armor. It wasn't long before Mrs. Turner found something. Late one evening, she called Aaliyah's parents with urgent news. "We've uncovered some concerning information about Mr. Daniels," Mrs. Turner said, her voice firm through the speakerphone. "There have been multiple complaints against him over the years, disciplinary actions that seem to disproportionately target Black and minority students, but none of these complaints were ever formally pursued by the district." Aaliyah's mom sat back, stunned. "They buried it all." "Yes," Mrs. Turner replied. "It looks like the district has been sweeping these cases under the rug to avoid bad publicity, but I think we can bring it to light if Aaliyah is willing to testify." Aaliyah felt her heart pound. Testifying in court was intimidating. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was representing every student who had ever felt silenced by an unfair system. Her dad gave her a reassuring nod. "You've come this far, Aaliyah. Whatever happens next, we'll be with you every step of the way." After a moment of quiet reflection, Aaliyah found her resolve. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll testify." The school district strikes back. As soon as the legal proceedings were announced, the school district fought back. Aaliyah's family received an official letter from the district's lawyers stating that the suspension was justified under the school's dress code and that Aaliyah had violated professional grooming standards. The language was sterile, clinical, designed to shift blame onto Aaliyah, while masking the deeper issue of racial bias. But the letter didn't stop there. The district claimed that Alia's public statements were damaging the school's reputation and implied that her family could face legal consequences for defamation. When Alia read the letter, her blood ran cold. "They're trying to scare us," she whispered. Her mom scoffed. "Let them try. They messed with the wrong family." Mrs. Turner assured them that the district's letter was nothing more than an intimidation tactic. "They know they're in trouble," she said. "They're just hoping to bully you into backing down." But Alia wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Allies in unexpected places. As the court date approached, Alia's family found allies in unexpected places. Teachers from other schools reached out, sharing their own frustrations with the district's policies. Some confessed they had faced retaliation for speaking up about discriminatory practices in the past. One day, Alia received an email from Mrs. Rivera, her former math teacher. "I just wanted you to know," Mrs. Rivera wrote, "that many of us are proud of what you're doing. I wish I had been brave enough to stand up when I saw these things happening before. If you need me to testify, I'll be there." It wasn't just teachers rallying behind Alia. Local politicians, advocacy groups, and even celebrities took notice of her story. A popular actress tweeted, "Alia's hair isn't unprofessional. It's beautiful. It's hers. And it deserves to be celebrated, not punished. #StandWithAlia." With each new voice joining the chorus, Alia felt less alone. The fight was still daunting, but she no longer carried the burden by herself. Secrets began to unravel. 2 weeks before the trial, Mrs. Turner uncovered another bombshell. An anonymous tip from a former staff member at East Lake High. The source provided emails between Mr. Daniels and other administrators, revealing a disturbing pattern. Mr. Daniels had pressured teachers to issue harsher punishments to students of color under the guise of maintaining order. One email in particular sent a chill down Alia's spine. In it, Mr. Daniels wrote, "We need to set an example. Students who don't comply with grooming standards, especially the troublemakers, should be dealt with swiftly. We can't afford to let things get out of hand." Mrs. Turner's voice was grave when she shared the news. This isn't just about hair anymore. This is about a pattern of targeting and silencing students based on race. Alia's mom clenched her fists in anger. "He's been doing this for years." "Yes," Mrs. Turner replied. "And now we have the evidence to expose him." Preparing for the courtroom battle. The night before the trial, Alia sat in her room, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She stared at the mirror, running her fingers through her curls. These same curls, beautiful, defiant, and uncontainable, had sparked a movement. Her mom walked in and sat beside her. "You ready for tomorrow?" Alia gave a small nod. "Yeah, I think I am." Her mom smiled and handed her a small worn-out journal. "This belonged to your grandmother," she said softly. She wrote about her own struggles, about how she fought for her place in a world that didn't want to see her shine. Alia opened the journal and found a quote scribbled on the first page. "Our beauty is not up for debate. We will not apologize for being who we are." Tears welled in Alia's eyes as she hugged her mom tightly. "You come from a long line of fighters," her mom whispered. "And tomorrow, you'll show them what that means." The first day of the trial. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Alia and her family arrived. Reporters filled the hallway, and the public gallery was packed with supporters holding signs of encouragement. As Alia took her seat at the plaintiff's table beside Mrs. Turner, she locked eyes with Mr. Daniels for the first time since her suspension. He sat rigidly, his expression cold and unmoving. But Alia saw something in his eyes. Fear. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings began. Mrs. Turner opened with a powerful statement. "This case is not just about a hairstyle. It's about a young girl's right to exist as she is, without being punished for her identity. It's about holding institutions accountable for the harm they cause when they treat cultural expression as a problem to be erased." Alia's heart swelled with pride as the judge nodded thoughtfully. The first witness was Mrs. Rivera, her former teacher, who testified about the ways students of color had been disproportionately targeted under Mr. Daniels' leadership. But the most powerful moment came when Aaliyah took the stand. With steady breath and unwavering resolve, she told her story. How she had been made to feel like her very existence was a distraction. How she had been punished for daring to embrace her natural self. And as she spoke, she realized something profound. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every student who had ever felt invisible, unworthy, or ashamed of who they were. Testimonies that shatter the silence. The courtroom grew tense with each passing hour. The spotlight had shifted from Aaliyah's suspension to the murky undercurrents of the school district's discriminatory practices. But the real turning point was about to begin. Aaliyah's testimony had lit the spark, and now others were stepping forward to fan the flames. Aaliyah faces cross-examination. After sharing her story, Aaliyah braced herself for the school's defense lawyer. He approached the witness stand with the polished air of someone who thought he could dismantle her story bit by bit. "You say that the suspension was unjust," he began, pacing slowly. "But isn't it true that the school's dress code clearly outlines standards for grooming?" "Yes," Aaliyah replied firmly, "but it doesn't ban natural hair. The rule said nothing about curls, braids, or afros. My hair didn't violate any part of the policy." The lawyer's eyes narrowed slightly. "So, are you suggesting that the policy was enforced unfairly, just in your case?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. "It wasn't just me," she said quietly but confidently. "I know other students were treated the same way. They just didn't have the support or platform to fight back. But I do." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Aaliyah held her head high, knowing the truth was on her side. A parade of witnesses. Over the next few days, the trial brought forth a range of witnesses, teachers, former students, and even staff members who had left the school district in frustration. Each one added new layers to the story, exposing years of covert discrimination under Mr. Daniels' leadership. Mrs. Rivera, the math teacher who had emailed Aaliyah, delivered a heartfelt testimony. "I watched students of color, especially black girls, be singled out for things that other students got away with," she admitted. "When Aaliyah was suspended, I knew it wasn't really about her hair. It was about control. They wanted to send a message: stay in line or face the consequences." A former school counselor named Mr. Lawson also took the stand. He revealed troubling patterns in the school's disciplinary data. "I flagged it repeatedly," he said. "Minority students were more likely to be suspended for subjective infractions, like disrespect or disruptive behavior. And every time I raised my concerns, I was told to let it go for the sake of the school's image." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was becoming increasingly clear that Aaliyah's suspension was part of a larger, deliberate strategy to suppress cultural expression and silence dissent. The anonymous whistleblower speaks out. Then came the most shocking testimony of all. Mrs. Turner had managed to track down the anonymous whistleblower, the former staff member who had leaked Mr. Daniels' emails. Her name was Ms. Green, and she had worked in the administrative office at East Lake High for 5 years before quitting in disgust. "I can't stay silent anymore," Ms. Green said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I saw everything. Mr. Daniels instructed teachers to watch certain students more closely, especially black girls who wore their hair naturally. He said it was about setting an example. But it was really about forcing them to conform, about making them feel small." Ms. Green produced copies of emails that corroborated her claims. One of them, addressed to a teacher struggling to enforce grooming policies, read, "Remind the student that it's not just about rules. It's about representing our school's values. If they can't adjust, they'll have to face the consequences." The courtroom erupted in whispered outrage. Mr. Daniels takes the stand. When Mr. Daniels was finally called to testify, his demeanor had shifted. Gone was the confident principal who had dismissed Aaliyah's concerns with bureaucratic indifference. Now he looked cornered, as if the weight of his actions was pressing down on him for the first time. Mrs. Turner questioned him with precision, her tone calm but relentless. "Mr. Daniels, Can you explain why students of color were punished more frequently for subjective offenses under your leadership? Daniels shifted uncomfortably. We enforced the rules equally across the board, he stammered. But isn't it true, Mrs. Turner continued, that you personally instructed teachers to target certain students, specifically students who wore their hair naturally? Daniels flushed. That's a mischaracterization. Mrs. Turner cut him off by holding up one of his incriminating emails. Then how do you explain this? You told teachers to make an example of students who didn't comply with grooming standards. Daniels tried to deflect, but the damage had already been done. The court could see the pattern, the intention behind his actions, and with Mize Green's testimony fresh in everyone's mind, his credibility crumbled. A community rises. Outside the courthouse, the movement that Aaliyah had sparked was in full swing. Crowds gathered every day, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "Hair is not a distraction," and "We wear our identity proudly." Local news stations covered the protests, and the story went national. Activists and public figures rallied behind Aaliyah, calling for an end to discriminatory grooming policies, not just in her district, but across the country. The pressure on the school board intensified. Board members, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, began issuing public statements condemning Mr. Daniels' actions. Behind closed doors, the board made a quiet offer. If Aaliyah dropped the case, they would reinstate her, expunge her record, and issue a general apology. But Aaliyah refused. "This isn't just about me anymore," she told her parents. "It's about making sure no other student has to go through what I did." The verdict. After days of deliberation, the judge delivered the final verdict. The court found that the school's actions were not only unjust, but also rooted in systemic bias. Mr. Daniels was ordered to resign immediately, and the district was mandated to implement new policies promoting cultural inclusivity and fairness in disciplinary practices. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Aaliyah's family embraced her tightly, tears of relief and pride streaming down their faces. The judge also awarded damages to Aaliyah's family, acknowledging the emotional toll the ordeal had taken. But more than the money, Aaliyah cherished the victory, the knowledge that her fight had made a difference. Aaliyah's legacy begins. In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah's story inspired policy changes not only at her school but across the state. Districts everywhere began revisiting their grooming policies, with many banning restrictions on natural hairstyles entirely. Aaliyah returned to school, greeted by classmates and teachers, who now saw her not just as a student but as a trailblazer. And as she walked through the hallways with her curls bouncing freely, she felt a new sense of belonging, a feeling that she had earned. Her story didn't end in that courtroom. It became the foundation for something greater, a legacy of courage, identity, and change. And every time a student was told they couldn't wear their hair a certain way, they had Aaliyah's example to remind them. Your identity is your strength. Don't let anyone take that away. After the battle, a new normal emerges. Though the verdict was in her favor, Aaliyah quickly realized that victories in court didn't mean everything would change overnight. The fight against discrimination had ended in a legal sense, but the aftershocks were only beginning. As her life slowly returned to what some might call normal, Aaliyah discovered that healing, acceptance, and understanding would take time, and new battles were still waiting in the shadows. Returning to school, not quite the same. Walking back through the school doors for the first time since the suspension felt surreal. Whispers followed Aaliyah wherever she went. Some students treated her like a hero, giving her high fives in the hallway, while others seemed unsure how to act around her, offering only awkward glances. "She's the girl who took down Daniels," one student whispered to another as she passed. Aaliyah caught fragments of conversations. Some classmates looked at her with admiration, while others, especially those aligned with Daniels' old authority, resented her victory. Her friend Jordan ran up to her during lunch, grinning ear to ear. "You're back, Aaliyah. And you're famous. I saw you on the news last week." Aaliyah laughed, feeling grateful for Jordan's easy friendship. Yeah, but fame is exhausting. I just want to pass chemistry without people staring at me. Despite Jordan's enthusiasm, Alia still sensed underlying tension in the air. Some teachers were overly polite, trying too hard to prove they weren't biased, while others seemed visibly uncomfortable, as if her presence reminded them of Daniel's downfall. She wondered how many of them had silently agreed with Daniels, and how many were just glad the whole ordeal was over. Confronting the tensions within the community. Outside school, the community's response was equally mixed. Some parents felt empowered, grateful that Alia's case had exposed long-standing discrimination. They began organizing town hall meetings, urging the district to reevaluate other policies that disproportionately targeted marginalized students. But not everyone was happy with the changes. A vocal minority of parents expressed frustration, claiming that the school's focus on inclusivity came at the expense of discipline and order. At a PTA meeting, Alia's mother, Simone, found herself in the middle of a heated discussion. "This whole thing has gone too far," one parent argued. "What's next? Are we going to let kids show up in pajamas because it's part of their identity?" After the battle, a new normal emerges. Though the verdict was in her favor, Alia quickly realized that victories in court didn't mean everything would change overnight. The fight against discrimination had ended in a legal sense, but the aftershocks were only beginning. As her life slowly returned to what some might call normal, Alia discovered that healing, acceptance, and understanding would take time. And new battles were still waiting in the shadows. Returning to school, not quite the same. Walking back through the school doors for the first time since the suspension felt surreal. Whispers followed Alia wherever she went. Some students treated her like a hero, giving her high fives in the hallway, while others seemed unsure how to act around her, offering only awkward glances. "She's the girl who took down Daniels," one student whispered to another as she passed. Alia caught fragments of conversations. Some classmates looked at her with admiration, while others, especially those aligned with Daniel's old authority, resented her victory. Her friend Jordan ran up to her during lunch, grinning ear to ear. "You're back, Alia. And you're famous. I saw you on the news last week." Alia laughed, feeling grateful for Jordan's easy friendship. "Yeah, but fame is exhausting. I just want to pass chemistry without people staring at me." Despite Jordan's enthusiasm, Alia still sensed underlying tension in the air. Some teachers were overly polite, trying too hard to prove they weren't biased, while others seemed visibly uncomfortable, as if her presence reminded them of Daniel's downfall. She wondered how many of them had silently agreed with Daniels, and how many were just glad the whole ordeal was over. Confronting the tensions within the community. Outside school, the community's response was equally mixed. Some parents felt empowered, grateful that Alia's case had exposed long-standing discrimination. They began organizing town hall meetings, urging the district to reevaluate other policies that disproportionately targeted marginalized students. But not everyone was happy with the changes. A vocal minority of parents expressed frustration, claiming that the school's focus on inclusivity came at the expense of discipline and order. At a PTA meeting, Alia's mother, Simone, found herself in the middle of a heated discussion. "This whole thing has gone too far," one parent argued. "What's next? Are we going to let kids show up in pajamas because it's part of their identity?" Simone responded calmly but firmly. "This was never about breaking rules. It was about fairness. My daughter's hair isn't a statement of rebellion. It's a part of who she is. All she asked for was to be treated with the same respect as anyone else." Alia, sitting quietly beside her mom, felt a wave of pride. Simone's words were steady and unapologetic, a reflection of the strength that had carried their family through the ordeal. Though the tension lingered, it was clear that the conversation had shifted. Alia's case had forced people to confront uncomfortable truths, and while not everyone would change their minds, the district was now accountable in ways it hadn't been before. Friendships tested and renewed. Aliyah noticed subtle changes in her relationships too. Some of her friends had drifted away during the trial, perhaps out of fear of being caught up in the controversy. Others, like Jordan, had stood by her side throughout, offering support when she needed it most. But one friendship in particular weighed heavily on her mind: her best friend, Tessa. Before the suspension, they had been inseparable, but during the trial, Tessa had gone quiet. She stopped texting, skipped hangouts, and avoided Aliyah at school. One afternoon, Aliyah decided to confront her. She found Tessa sitting on the bleachers after class, scrolling through her phone. "Hey," Aliyah said, her voice gentle but firm. Tessa looked up, guilt flashing across her face. "Hey." Aliyah sat beside her. "I need to know, why did you disappear when I needed you?" Tessa sighed, setting her phone down. "I was scared, Aliyah. Everything got so big. My parents didn't want me getting involved. They thought the whole thing was too risky." Aliyah's chest tightened. "Risky? For who? You weren't the one being targeted." Tessa looked down, ashamed. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to handle it." For a moment, Aliyah considered walking away, cutting ties and never looking back. But then she remembered what her mom always said: forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself. "I get it," Aliyah said finally, though her voice carried the weight of hurt. "But if you want to be in my life, you need to show up. No more disappearing when things get tough." Tessa nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I will. I promise." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward. A new role: mentor and advocate. As the months passed, Aliyah began to embrace her newfound role as an advocate. She started volunteering with local organizations focused on education reform and anti-discrimination policies. Teachers and students from other schools reached out, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. One day, Aliyah received an invitation to speak at a nearby high school. Nervous but determined, she stood in front of an auditorium packed with students, parents, and teachers. "I never set out to be an activist," she told the crowd. "I just wanted to wear my hair the way it grows naturally." But sometimes, standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts with small acts of courage. Her words resonated deeply, and afterward, students lined up to thank her. Some shared stories of their own struggles, grateful for her example. Mr. Daniels' absence, and the path forward. With Mr. Daniels gone, the school underwent significant changes. The district appointed an interim principal, Ms. Hampton, who promised to rebuild trust and create a more inclusive environment. Ms. Hampton called a meeting with Aliyah and a few other students to discuss the changes they wanted to see. "We're not just here to put out fires," Ms. Hampton told them. "We're here to build something better, and I want your voices to guide us." For the first time, Aliyah felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for future students who wouldn't have to fight the same battles she did. Reflecting on the journey, on the anniversary of the trial's verdict, Aliyah sat with her family at the kitchen table, scrolling through photos from the past year. There were pictures of protests, newspaper articles, and smiling faces from events where she had spoken. "I still can't believe how far we've come," Aliyah said, looking at her parents. Her dad smiled. "You made it happen, kid. You turned a fight over a suspension into something much bigger." Aliyah glanced at her reflection in the window. Her curls framed her face, wild and free, a constant reminder of the battle she had fought and the identity she had reclaimed. As she leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace settled over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew she could handle whatever came next. She had learned to embrace her strength, her voice, and her identity. And that was a victory no one could take away. Ripple effects and the seeds of change. Months after the court's ruling, Aliyah began to notice something extraordinary. Her story had grown beyond the walls of her school and the courtroom. What started as one girl's fight against an unjust suspension had sparked conversations far beyond her hometown influencing policies, attitudes, and lives in ways she never imagined. But as Aliyah would come to learn, meaningful change wasn't just about winning battles, it was about nurturing the seeds planted along the way. A movement in the making. The school district's swift policy reforms soon became a blueprint for neighboring districts. Other schools, some with dress codes even stricter than Aliyah's, began reevaluating their own rules. Teachers and administrators were encouraged to take cultural competency training, and several districts officially banned discriminatory grooming policies. In one surprising twist, a local news station ran a segment titled, "From Suspension to Reform: The Girl Who Changed the Rules." The coverage went viral, spreading Aliyah's story across social media platforms. Activists and students across the country began using hashtags like #CurlsandPride and #RespectHerRoots to share their own experiences of discrimination. The movement resonated with a wide audience, bringing together people from different backgrounds to demand more inclusive environments in schools and workplaces. Aliyah never expected to become the face of a movement, but as she scrolled through messages from students she had never met, thanking her for inspiring them to stand up for themselves, she realized just how powerful her actions had been. Old enemies, new fronts. Despite the progress, resistance persisted. Some parents and former staff from her school formed a coalition opposing the reforms. They insisted that loosening dress codes would lead to chaos, lamenting the loss of traditional values. The local news aired debates between supporters of the changes and critics who believed the new policies were too lenient. Aliyah's family received anonymous hate mail, and she was targeted by online trolls accusing her of being a troublemaker. Although these attacks hurt, Aliyah had grown tougher through her experiences. She learned to focus on those standing with her rather than those tearing her down. At a town hall meeting addressing further reforms, a middle-aged man stood up, frustrated. "This girl's case is blowing everything out of proportion. Rules are rules for a reason." Aliyah, sitting in the audience, raised her hand and calmly responded, "If rules are hurting people, it's our job to change them. Tradition isn't an excuse for injustice." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement. Even those on the fence began to see that this movement wasn't about rebellion, but about fairness and dignity. Mentoring the next generation. As Aliyah's story spread, younger students began seeking her advice. They admired her courage and wanted to make their voices heard too. Some felt overwhelmed by their own school environments, unsure how to confront unfair treatment. Aliyah started volunteering at a youth center, mentoring kids facing similar challenges. One girl named Kara, who had been punished for wearing her natural hair in braids, came to Aliyah in tears. "They say my braids are distracting," Kyra whispered, clutching her notebook tightly. "I just want to fit in, but I don't want to change who I am." Aliyah knelt beside her, brushing a tear from the girl's cheek. "You don't have to fit in by hiding who you are. People like you and me, we make the world change by being ourselves." Kyra's eyes brightened, and from that moment on, she wore her braids proudly, knowing she wasn't alone. The long road to healing. While advocating for others gave Aliyah a sense of purpose, she couldn't ignore the emotional toll the past year had taken. The stress, the legal battles, the public scrutiny, all of it weighed heavily on her. Even victories came with exhaustion. Her parents encouraged her to prioritize self-care. Her father took her fishing on weekends, and her mom introduced her to yoga. Slowly, Aliyah began to rediscover joy in small moments, playing with her younger siblings, journaling late at night, or simply lying on the grass, watching clouds drift by. One evening, her mother said something that stayed with her. "You don't have to save the world all at once, baby. It's okay to rest. The seeds you've planted will grow, even when you step away for a while." Aliyah nodded, knowing her mom was right. She had learned that healing was just as important as fighting, and that both were part of the journey. Unexpected allies. Just as things began to settle, Aliyah received an unexpected letter from a former teacher, Ms. Bailey, the guidance counselor who had initially supported Mr. Daniels. "I owe you an apology," the letter read. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing by supporting the dress code, but I've come to realize that I was part of the problem. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Thank you for your courage. Aaliyah folded the letter and placed it in her keepsake box, feeling a strange mix of emotions: validation, relief, and perhaps even forgiveness. Change, she realized, could come from the most unlikely places. The legacy begins. By the end of the school year, Aaliyah's efforts culminated in something tangible: a new student-led advisory council dedicated to fostering inclusivity and fairness. The council worked with administrators to identify areas where policies could improve and hosted workshops encouraging dialogue between students and teachers. At the council's first meeting, Ms. Hampton, the interim principal, addressed the room. "You are the future," she told the students. "Your voices matter, and your leadership will shape the culture of this school for years to come." Aaliyah smiled, feeling a swell of pride. This was what she had fought for, not just her own freedom, but a better future for everyone who followed in her footsteps. A personal milestone. On the last day of school, Aaliyah stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting her graduation cap over her curls. For a brief moment, she thought about Mr. Daniels and the battle that had started with something as simple as her hair. She smiled at her reflection, proud of how far she had come. This moment wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. As she walked across the stage to accept her diploma, the applause was thunderous. She spotted Kyra and other younger students in the audience, cheering her on with shining eyes. In that moment, Aaliyah knew she had become more than a student. She was now a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that one person's courage could change the world.